I have been waiting for you. Welcome to my domain, the Portal of Dread. Here, each story is not merely a tale, but a portal I open directly to your worst nightmares. With me, fear is not just told, it is felt in the soul. Turn off the light. Lock the door. Let your own breath guide you through the inevitable labyrinth of madness. If you possess the foolish courage to cross this threshold, subscribe to the channel. And to prove your insolence, type in the comments, "I am not afraid." Now, prepare yourself. The unknown is already here. Today's story, the guardian of the last crime scenes. What if the dead could send a message? Not through a Ouija board or a famous TV medium, but through a complete stranger, with a detail so intimate, so specific, that only you and the person who passed could possibly know. Irrefutable proof that consciousness survives the final breath, sent directly to you. What would you do with that message? For Leo, the world was divided into two phases, the before and the after. The before was the chaos, the violence, the tragedy that left its indelible marks on the walls and floors of homes and businesses. The after was what he provided. Leo wasn't a cop or a forensics expert. He was a crime scene cleaner, a professional who arrived after all the sirens had faded and the yellow tape was the only remaining witness. His job was to erase the physical evidence of horror, to return a semblance of normalcy to a place violated by death. He transformed the stage of a nightmare back into a silent, empty space, a job that required an iron stomach and a shielded heart. Over the years, that shield began to feel too heavy. Each scene became just another stain to be removed, another odor to be neutralized. The humanity behind the tragedies was fading, and Leo felt more like a machine than a man. He began to question the purpose of his craft. Was he truly bringing peace or just erasing stories, silencing the final echoes of an interrupted life? This doubt gnawed at him from the inside, turning his already solitary job into something profoundly desolate. He was on the edge, considering quitting to find a line of work where life was more present than death. That's when he took a call for a job at an old art studio downtown. A young, promising painter named Raphael, no older than 23, had been the victim of a brutal robbery homicide. The scene was a mixture of beauty and barbarity. Vibrant canvases, full of life, contrasted with the violence that had unfolded there. The smell of oil paint mingled with the metallic odor Leo knew so well. It was just another job, another tragic story to be methodically erased from the environment. As he cleaned the stained hardwood floor, Leo felt something different. There was a sadness in the air that seemed thicker, more palpable than usual. He worked for hours with an almost reverent care, treating the studio not as a crime scene, but as a desecrated sanctuary. He cleaned every blood-stained brush, every splatter on the untouched canvases, feeling a deep respect for the talent that had been silenced there. When he finished, the place was spotless, but the feeling of melancholy followed him home like a persistent shadow. Weeks passed, and the image of the studio began to fade into the routine of other, equally grim jobs. On Saturday afternoon, looking for a distraction, Leo walked into a small antique shop he'd never visited before. He was looking for an old frame for a family photo. As he examined the dusty objects, the shop's owner, an elderly woman with white hair and very observant eyes named Mrs. Elvira, approached him. She watched him for a moment before speaking, her voice low and a little shaky. "Sir, forgive my intrusion, but I have to ask you something. Do you work with art?" Leo, surprised, shook his head and vaguely explained his profession. The woman insisted, "It's just that for weeks I've been having the same dream about a young man, a painter, and in this dream he asks me to deliver a message to a man who cleaned his final canvas." A chill ran down Leo's spine. He stood frozen, staring at the old woman. How could she possibly know that? He had never spoken about the studio case with anyone. Mrs. Elvira continued, describing the young man from her dream with frightening accuracy. She described his curly hair, the mole near his eye, and then came the detail that made the floor disappear from under Leo's feet. "He shows me his hands," she said, her eyes welling up. "His hands are covered in colorful paint, but his right hand is broken, the fingers bent at a horrible angle. He says that's how they found him, and that only the man who cleaned the place would know that detail, because he was the one who straightened his hand before the body was taken away." It was true. In a gesture of compassion he never reported, Leo had gently straightened the painter's fractured fingers, a final act of respect for the artist's most important tool. "Before I reveal the message that crossed the barrier of death, I want to invite you to do something." If stories like Leo's fascinate you, if you believe there is more between heaven and earth than we can explain, subscribe to the Dread Portal. And now, a challenge. Look at your right hand for a moment. What did it create today? What did it touch? Comment below with the last meaningful thing your hands did. Let's create a mural of actions, a counterpoint to today's story. Leo could barely breathe. That gesture, that small act of humanity performed in the silence of a crime scene, was a secret kept only by him and apparently by the deceased himself. He nodded, unable to form words. Mrs. Elvira seemed relieved, as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "He asked me to tell you something," she continued, her voice firmer now. "He said, 'Thank the man who cleaned my final canvas. Tell him I saw his care. He didn't erase my art, he honored it. He didn't just clean the blood, he brought peace to my chaos. Tell him not to give up, because his work isn't about the end, but about preparing the way for memory to begin.'" The message hit him like a wave. It wasn't a haunting, it was a thank you, a validation from the most unlikely place imaginable. That young painter, Raphael, didn't see Leo's work as an act of erasure, but as a final act of curation. Where Leo saw only the duty to clean up a mess, the artist's spirit saw someone who treated his sacred space with a dignity that not even his killers had. The message was clear. Leo's work had a much greater purpose than he had ever imagined. He wasn't a janitor of the macabre, but a guardian of the transition, someone who tended to the threshold between presence and absence. In that moment, in the middle of a dusty antique shop, the shield around Leo's heart didn't just crack, it shattered. The weight he carried wasn't from his job, but from his own misunderstanding of it. Still in shock, Leo needed one more confirmation, a final detail to eliminate any possibility of it being a bizarre coincidence. He composed himself and asked Mrs. Elvira, his voice hoarse, Did he say anything else? Any detail about the place?" The woman closed her eyes for a moment, as if accessing a memory that wasn't her own. "Yes," she said, slowly opening her eyes. "He mentioned a paintbrush, a very small one, with a very fine tip, made of marten hair. He said it was his favorite for the details in the eyes he painted. And he was happy because you found it under the cabinet and put it back on the table with the others. He said it was as if you had put his tool to rest." The air left Leo's lungs. It was impossible, completely impossible. That tiny brush had rolled into a dark corner, and he only found it at the very end of the cleanup. It was an automatic, almost unconscious gesture to place it back with the others. No one saw, no one could have known, no one living. That trivial detail, the fate of a small paintbrush, was the final signature on the message from beyond. There was no more room for doubt or skepticism. Leo thanked Mrs. Elvira, bought the first frame he saw, and walked out of the antique shop, feeling the world spin. The busy street, the cars, the people, everything seemed different, as if a new layer of reality had been revealed to him. The desolation he felt about his work was replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer alone on his journeys through crime scenes. There were silent witnesses, and one of them had taken the trouble to send him a message of gratitude. That day marked the end of the after, and the beginning of something entirely new. The experience with Mrs. Elvira and the message from Raphael opened a rift in Leo's perception of the world. He began to notice things he had previously ignored. small anomalies and sensations in the places he worked. It wasn't fear, but a heightened awareness, as if his senses had been tuned to a new frequency. The most disturbing confirmation, however, didn't come from a crime scene, but from his own home. One night, he arrived exhausted after cleaning the scene of a domestic dispute that had ended in a fatality. His son, Lucas, only 6 years old, was in the living room, drawing on a piece of paper. "Daddy, I made a new friend today," the boy said, without looking up from his drawing. Leo smiled, tired. "Oh yeah, champ. And what's his name?" Lucas replied without hesitation. "He didn't say his name. He just said he's sad because the lady who lived with him screamed a lot, and now she's sleeping forever." Leo's blood ran cold. The lady sleeping forever was a terrifyingly accurate description of the case he had just worked. He walked over and looked at his son's drawing. It was a child's scribble, but it showed 2 figures, one large and one small, and the large figure had a big red smudge on its chest. "Daddy, my friend said the lady fell near the bookshelf and knocked over the blue flower vase. He told me to tell you to be careful with the broken glass." Leo's stomach turned. There had, in fact, been a broken blue vase near the bookshelf, a detail that wouldn't be in any news report. His 6-year-old son was describing the crime scene with impossible precision. Lucas's imaginary friend wasn't imaginary. It was an echo, a presence that had followed him home. From that day on, Leo understood that his work had made him a kind of beacon in the dark, a bridge between the world of the departed and the world of the living. The presences weren't threatening, but melancholic, as if seeking one last listener. This new reality was put to the harshest test a few months later with a case that shook not only him, but his entire small team. An arson at a suburban home had claimed the lives of an entire family, a father, a mother, and their teenage daughter. When Leo and his 2 assistants arrived, the smell of smoke and the sight of the destruction were overwhelming. Soot covered everything like a shroud of mourning, and the few objects that remained were charred witnesses to a happy life. The work was emotionally excruciating. In every room, they found traces of the family who had lived there. A melted picture frame in the living room, a notebook with a burned cover in the girls' room, a pair of shoes by the door. Unlike other cases, a deep, shared sadness fell over the team. No one spoke much. The silence was heavy, laden with a pain that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. They didn't feel a specific presence, but an overwhelming absence, a vacuum of energy that drained their own strength. By the end of the 2 intense days of work, everyone was exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually drained, as if they had carried a piece of that tragedy in their own souls. In the days following the cleanup of the burned house, the atmosphere at Leo's small company remained somber. His assistants, normally light-hearted and resilient, were quiet and introspective. Leo himself felt a persistent anguish in his chest, a sense of foreboding he couldn't explain. It was more than the usual fatigue after a difficult case. It was as if the tragedy had clung to them, a dense gray energy. He spoke with his team, and they both reported the same feeling, an inexplicable sadness and nightmares of fire and smoke. They felt as if something terrible was still about to happen, a collective sense that the story wasn't over. The confirmation of this premonition came 3 days later on the local news. One of the firefighters who had bravely fought the blaze at that house, a young, newly married man, had been in a fatal motorcycle accident while off duty. He lost control on a curve and crashed violently. The news hit Leo's team like a bomb. The chill was instantaneous and collective. That oppressive feeling that had been haunting them wasn't just grief for the family. It was an echo, a premonition of the second tragedy that was to come, directly linked to the first. It was as if death, once drawn to that event, had created a shockwave, and they, being at the epicenter, had felt the vibration before anyone else. The firefighter's death solidified a theory Leo had been forming in his mind. Some places, some tragedies, didn't end when the police tape was removed or the cleaning was done. They left behind a resonance, a scar on the fabric of reality that could affect anyone who came near. That fire hadn't just taken 3 lives, it had created a vortex of misfortune. And the firefighter, a hero who had dived headfirst into that darkness to save others, ended up being pulled in by it too. The sense of dread Leo's team felt wasn't a haunting, but an extreme empathy, an attunement to the pain and chaos that still lingered in the air, a kind of psychic alert to the impending doom. Leo began to look at his work in a new light. He wasn't just cleaning organic matter, he was dealing with residual energy. He started adopting small rituals before and after each job, moments of silence, thoughts of respect for those who had passed, a mental cleansing so as not to carry the echoes with him. He understood that the shield he used to wear wasn't to protect himself from the visual horror, but from the energetic contamination that some places possessed. The message from Raphael, the painter, taught him about purpose, but the tragedy of the fire taught him about the danger and the responsibility of walking on such charged ground. He was indeed a bridge, and bridges need to be strong and well-maintained so they don't collapse under the weight of what crosses them. This new awareness transformed how Leo interacted with the world. He became more observant, more sensitive to the invisible currents that flow beneath the surface of everyday life. He remembered an incident from years ago, which at the time he had dismissed as nonsense. He had entered a religious supply store to buy a gift, and the clerk, a man who had never seen him before, took a step back upon seeing him. "My friend," the man had said with wide eyes, "you don't walk alone. So many sad shadows you carry on your back." At the time, Leo had laughed and left. Now the memory returned with a frightening weight. Maybe the man wasn't a charlatan. Maybe he saw what Leo now felt, the traces, the echoes of the interrupted lives he visited every day. He no longer felt like a machine. On the contrary, he felt more human than ever. Each case was a story, each location a sanctuary, and each task a ritual. He taught his assistants the importance of respect, not just for the job, but for the memories they were cleaning. They began to see themselves not as mere service providers, but as the last ones to care for a space, the ones responsible for bringing a dignified conclusion to a violent chapter. Fear gave way to reverence. Desolation gave way to a sense of sacred duty. Leo finally understood that his job wasn't to erase the past, but to allow the future, for the families and for the places themselves, to begin again, free from the visible stains of tragedy. Today, Leo continues his work, but with a completely renewed perspective. The message from the painter Raphael, delivered by the unlikely Mrs. Elvira, was the compass that reoriented his life. He no longer actively seeks signs or messages, but he remains open to them, accepting his sensitivity as part of who he is. He understands that by entering the darkest spaces of human experience, he offers a light, even if it's just the light of a cleaning product on a stained floor. He found beauty in the morbid, purpose in the chaos, and peace in the silence that follows the storm. He knows he never walks alone, but now he doesn't fear the shadows that accompany him. He recognizes them as the stories he helped bring to a close. He became the silent guardian of the final scenes, the man who arrives after the end to prepare a new beginning. His work, once a source of anguish, is now his mission. He doesn't just clean up what happened, he honors those who departed, offering one last act of care and dignity. The shield around his heart is gone, replaced by a deep empathy and an understanding that even in death, the need to be treated with respect is the last thing we have left. And sometimes, when the work is especially difficult, he remembers the young painter's words and knows that, on the other side of the veil, someone is grateful. Leo's story shows us that sometimes the most important messages come from the quietest places, and that purpose can be found in the most unexpected professions. If you felt a chill, if this story touched something in you, join our community here at the Dread Portal. Your subscription is what allows us to keep bringing you these narratives from the threshold. But more than that, we want to hear from you. Have you ever felt an unexplainable presence? Have you ever received a sign that defied logic? Share your story in the comments. Let's turn this space into a great digital campfire, where our experiences meet and remind us that we are not alone in the dark. What did you learn from Leo's journey? Thank you for watching and for being part of our family. Thank you for crossing this dark night with us at the Dread Portal. Now tell me, would you have the courage to go through this? Share in the comments if you can sleep tonight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get more chilling stories every week. Sleep well, if you can. Until the next tale, good night, and see you in the next video from the Dread Portal.